Hi, everyone. Welcome to the session of Modernizing BC Central Data Warehouse Business Processes. My name is Zenon Kuryevich. I'm from the University of Manitoba, and we're happy to have you join us both in this room and across the country. For virtual attendees, please submit your questions throughout the presentation using by clicking on the Q&A icon in the side menu bar and typing in your questions. Upvote any questions that you really want answered, and hopefully we'll try to get to those. All questions will be posed at the end of the presentation if we have time for them, but please join me in welcoming this session's presenter, Patrick Lougheed.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much. So without too much further ado, however, of course, we'd like to start with a land acknowledgement of the various First Nations and, of course, the Métis, whose traditional territories on which we are gathered today, and as well, Plaid's offices and Capilano University are located on the traditional and unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples of British Columbia. Now, this was intended to be a tag team presentation. Dan was going to be joining us online. Unfortunately, he has fallen ill this weekend and is currently hopped up on Dayquil, he tells me. So he has opted to, unfortunately for you all, turn it all over to me. So with that, I am co-founder and chief solutions officer at Plaid Analytics, and we'll talk a little bit more about Plaid in just a minute. Capilano, on the other hand, is a special purpose teaching university in British Columbia, and they have three campuses, one in North Vancouver, one in Seashelf, and one in Lonsdale, which is another part of North Vancouver, but well away from their main campus. CapU enrolls approximately 12,700 students each year. And the Institutional Research Office at CAP submits data to BC's post-secondary central data warehouse every May and October. The CDW is a ministry system to which all of the colleges and the special purpose teaching universities and some of the research universities in British Columbia submit data to. The CDW process is used to derive both some internal reporting that we'll talk about, but also full-time equivalent calculations that form much of the ministry reporting and auditing that Capilano has to do. And ultimately, this process uses a variety of different systems currently. So there is Eleusin's banner. So the custom processes that right now create the CDW data are actually a custom banner module. There is QA check. We should probably put scare quotes around software because it's actually a series of SQL scripts that are provided by the ministry. There's an internal FTE audit tool that CAP has developed and some other related FTE scripts. And then there's multiple internal quality assurance scripts that are run against the CDW as well. Okay, so Plaid. In the time that you've already been listening to me, your enrollment forecast could be done. That's one of the things that we've helped a number of institutions with. If that's something that you're interested in, I will be over in Delta A and quite happy to talk about enrollment and ultimately tuition forecasting as well. But we also do a variety of other things such as data governance tools and, of course, some of the pieces that bring us here today around data warehouses and data pipelines. We do have a number of clients, many of whom are in the audience here today. We are focused exclusively on higher ed, where we don't do general data for other folks, and our backgrounds are in higher education. So that's really what brings us here. Yes. All right. So let's talk a little bit about what things currently look like. So right now, there's a number of business processes that are related to putting together the CDW submissions at CAP. So it starts off with a loading process, and then there's a bit of a data cleansing process. And the data cleaning process is probably the most manual step in this. Now, partly that's because there's new data that ends up in all of our systems. There's new programs that have to be coded. There's new courses that have to be coded, that sort of thing. But there's also a number of pieces of the current loading process that just don't happen and have to get dealt with manually. So as one example, a portion of the CDW data that has to get reported is around transfer credit. But the existing scripts that they've built into Banner don't deal with transfer credit at all. So manually after the fact, somebody has to go in and generate a whole raft of data about transfer credit so that it can be submitted to the ministry. This is obviously a less than ideal situation. Once the data is loaded and cleansed, then it really splits off into two separate processes. One, which is more internal and CAP focused around the FTE auditing and reporting internally. And then ultimately some submission to the ministry in another set of processes that are really around running the ministry's quality assurance checks and various reports that I mentioned that are all built into SQL. One of the things about the CDW submission is that while there is a whole raft of data that has to go to the ministry, there is also a piece of paper that has to go to the registrar to get wet signed and shipped off to the ministry as well. So giant Oracle database, single piece of paper. In terms of the actual loading, it's often a quite cyclical process. So when institutions submit to the central data warehouse, they're actually expected to submit, we're now up to about 22 years of data every year, which is to say they are expected to send, when they ship that database off, it's to include all of the data that they have going back to about 2001 to the present day. Some institutions have chosen to take the route of regenerating all 22 years of data every time they run their CDW load. The CAP has taken a slightly different tack in that they freeze previous years. And so when they're running their processes, they're really only running it for the current fiscal year. There's then a series of audits. So as the script goes through, it indicates, oh, you forgot to enter this data here or this other piece over here. And then ultimately, once that audit's been done and they're quite happy with the current fiscal year data, then it actually gets loaded into another database that contains the previous 21 years worth of data. And ultimately, when they run for future fiscal years, they have to empty out that data that they've generated. They keep the one database that's got the now 22 years of data, but they empty out the fiscal year by year one. There's a number of different things that kind of go into the data cleansing process. So I mentioned new courses and programs, of course, and having to make sure that those have appropriate SIP codes and ministry funding codes, those sorts of things. But there's also a number of pieces where the scripts really don't take into account the varied ways that data enters into our student information systems. So one example is around Aboriginal identity. So in CAP systems, there's actually nothing that keeps an international student from reporting that they're Aboriginal, which makes sense. There are many folks around the world, not just in Canada, who may be Indigenous to the place that they are. But in terms of reporting, that's not necessarily what CAP wants to report. And so there's extra checks around that. Dummy students, I'm sure that we all have students in our student information system that are not, in fact, students. How many people have Harry Potter? So making sure that those get cleaned out before the data gets shipped off to the ministry, that sort of thing. And I did mention the student course transfer that just doesn't get populated as part of the scripts and has to get added later on. And then there's a whole set of quality assurance checks that have to be done before the data gets provided to the ministry. And in fact, the ministry requires that these quality assurance, or that the results, the reports coming out of these quality assurance checks get submitted at the same time. I won't go into all of them. Some of them are, making sure that data that's in one table aligns with data that's in another table, that there's no, dangling pieces of data that really shouldn't be there. But also, general student or general reporting around making sure that there's enough data elements that have been submitted. So one that has been a bit of an interesting piece of contention over the last few years, as an example, is around the standard reporting. There's a desire to make sure that from the ministry that at least 99% of students have a gender code associated with them. Except the CDW hasn't quite maintained the being up to date and only accepted male and female. So of course, on the one side, on the application side, many institutions were allowing students to declare as non-binary or trans and using other codes. And then we're getting penalized for it on the CDW side because they weren't meeting that 99% threshold anymore. Now that one's being updated, to be clear. It's no longer like that as of last year, but some of the components that go into the standard reporting are things along those lines. And then ultimately, once that's all done, putting it all together, finalizing it, and shipping that off to the ministry. And this is where the registrar sign off as well comes in. And then a couple of other pieces. So I mentioned the FT audit tool, and this really takes data from the ministry and adds some data both from their internal banner system, but also takes it from various places in the CDW and puts it together in a format that they can really look at it internally and make sure that when they get audited around FTEs and the financial reporting that they do for the ministry, that this information is correct and that they have the appropriate reporting. And they do use some of this internally as well. All right, so that's what things look like today or a couple of months ago. Part of what we want to talk about today, of course, is where we're going, or where we have gone and where we are continuing to go with this particular project. So when CAP engaged us in this particular process, part of the difficulty that they were having was really about the manual intervention. And in no small part of this was because some of the knowledge about how to actually get from pressing the run button on the keyboard to get the scripts running to actually getting something to the ministry that was more or less complete. Much of that information was living in people's heads. Much of it was being done through a variety of additional components. For example, there was an access database that was being used to populate the transfer credit pieces. And that transfer credit database was being tweaked a little bit every time through. And so things were changing. So part of what we got asked to come in and do was really to modernize the workflow process, making it so that the extract, transform, and load processes that pulled data out of Banner and pushed it into the CDW could be run on a much more regular basis. So I mentioned the submissions are due May and October, but of course, May and October is too late to do anything. If you want to use this if you want to use CDW data for any kind of internal reporting so that you can actually change things as you go through the academic year, only running in May and October, less than ideal. And so being able to run in a much more constrained amount of time will allow us to run the data more regularly so that CAP could actually be reporting on it weekly or even more often if they wanted. improving the data cleansing process, decreasing the manual resources, improving some of the quality assurance checks, making it so some of those checks perhaps we could introduce logic to, so that if there wasn't a zip code assigned to a course, we could fall back to one at a subject level, for example, rather than requiring additional data entry. Improving the way that the various audit and calculation processes were happening, and ultimately making it so that rather than IT having to maintain a set of custom scripts that were in Banner and having to go through IT's prioritization processes, that sort of thing, that workflows could actually be maintained by the folks in institutional research. So really what we did was we started with the script that they have that worked for 80 to 90% of what they needed, and effectively ripped that all apart, figured out what logic it was using, because as I'm sure most of us have struggled with, these aren't always documented particularly well. And we rebuilt it into a series of workflows using a data transformation tool called FME from Safe Software. What used to be FME desktop was used to build and to validate the workflows. And we can show you what that looks like in a minute if anybody's interested. And then there's a related tool formerly called FME Server, now called FME Flow, where all of that can be automated, put together. Workflows can be put together in a sequence and run on a schedule. And if there's errors, the server can output those errors. Easiest form is generally email, but we can also do things like actually connect to, in CAP's case, Teams, or some other folks are using Slack, so we can actually real time say, oh, there was a problem with this, rather than people having to find it after the fact. We then went through a validation process where really we took what was coming out of those new workflows that we built and comparing that to the data that was already being generated by the scripts. One of the interesting things about these data validation processes is to me is always finding the little nuances in the old data that people didn't really know existed, and perhaps making some tweaks as we go. So there was a lot of validation, but there was also some places where we identified that we could in fact put the data together slightly more easily, or in a form that better represented CAP's underlying data. And of course, we wanted to make sure that we added in the components around, say, transfer credit that previously were being done manually, so that all of that could be done in an automated fashion. And we are, it says data was populated. We're now populating that into a test environment where CAP's team is busy doing the data validation before we actually go live, and making sure that there's nothing that got missed. So the workflows in a lot of ways mimic the existing scripts, in that we're loading data into tables that look like the final CDW tables, but they're really only for the current fiscal year, and they contain a couple of extra fields, so that we can use those both in downstream workflows, but also so that as we audit to make sure that the data is coming from the right place, that we can track that. Now, some of the data in the CDW is really term bound, so course sections as an example, and enrollments. So we can tell fairly easily, oh, the current fiscal year of data is from this term to this term. But some of the tables aren't term or time bound in the same way. So there's one students table that's expected to contain 22 years of students. And of course, students don't just enroll in 1 year, they can enroll in various different places. So after loading the data into the staging tables, then we have to go back to that historical database and remove people that only exist in the current fiscal year, but leave the people that were enrolled in previous fiscal years, so we don't break old data and that sort of thing. And then pull in, once once all the data has been validated into the staging tables, then we can pull that information into our historical data as well. And for right now, or at least as long as the scripts are continuing to run, we can run that comparison as well. And when we talk about the automations, the pieces that are no longer having to do, so essentially what we've done is we've built an automation that puts this all together in the right order, but also automates as much as possible. So we need to have a creation date related to all data that's in the CDW. And of course, as you generate data over time and you're only generating for certain fiscal years, those dates will actually change. So making sure that we have one consistent date for all of our current data load, as an example, even though the workflows themselves could be running over several hours or even several days if they start at 10 or 11 at night, as an example. Loading the staging tables and then removing and repopulating the new data and doing the comparison. All of that component gets automated. And piece I should have added here is that bit about actually providing a report ultimately to whoever, whether that be Teams or email, basically saying, okay, here's the results, here's the problems we found, here's the stuff that you need to go check, so that people don't have to poke around and say, where's the data wrong? They've actually just got the report right in front of them. And multiple people can work on it and split it out if needed. All right, so outcomes. I should say it's a little bit early. We haven't fully gone into production with this yet. Our hope is to be able to, certainly to be able to do next May's. Unfortunately, for a couple of reasons, including unfortunately many of the folks at CAP being involved in labor negotiation processes and not being at work for a while, kind of pushed back our timeline. So our original hope was to do this October submission. That didn't happen. So certainly for next May, but we want it running more regularly, at least weekly before that. But going through this process has really allowed for getting a better understanding of those current processes and figuring out where, in fact, we could make the improvements so that data better reflected CAP, but also ensuring that there weren't the manual interventions required. The whole piece at this point, we've got under 4 hours on here. At this point, it's actually closer to under 2. So running on a daily basis is actually quite realistic. Not sure that that's actually going to happen. We might stick with weekly, but certainly if you wanted to do daily while everybody sleeps, it's entirely possible. Replace the manual piece with the automated piece, being able to schedule, and really if they need to schedule or if they need to run off schedule, doing that is as easy as the click of a button. And the piece, we haven't got through the training piece yet, but ultimately the outcomes that we are aiming for is really for IR to be able to maintain these rather than having to bring in an IT specialist to maintain the workflows. All right, so apparently I am running slightly ahead of time. 1 second. Put that back over to me. Awesome. This is probably the largest of the workflows, and I'm not intending to. But this component actually pulls together data from. I'm not even sure I can count that. On the left hand side there, all of those little pieces. Each one of those is a banner table that we're pulling data out of. So call it. It's probably 50 in there that we're pulling data out of. And some of those, as I mentioned, are term bound, and that's part of the way that we can get some of this automation running more quickly. Is we don't have to pull in, even though we're theoretically populating a database that's got 25 years worth of data, and we're pulling out of an SIS that has 50. We can the components that we need that are term bound, we can pull out just the appropriate terms or the appropriate timeframes. And then what we're actually pushing out is data around what credentials did students receive. So for example, that kind of top block, that's all about the student credentials, and it pushes that out. And there's another component around what in courses students were enrolled in, what another component around what grades, another component around what did they apply to, and what programs were they actually enrolled in any given term. And then a little bit later on, it populates the student data and the program data. So it's all, there are a couple of other workflows that have been separated out, particularly around courses and what course sections were offered. But because the ones around students are so intertwined, students do strange things like graduate but not taking courses in a particular year, or they may both enroll and graduate, or they may only get transfer credit, as an example. So all of that's kind of woven into the same workflow, so that ultimately we can make sure that we're generating only the data that we need, and not a whole bunch extra. And with that, I will see if there's any questions.
Thank you for a great presentation. We're gonna open up the questions now, and we'll see if there's anything in the chat or in the audience. If you do have a question, we'll pass the microphone around. I'm personally interested in the enrollment projections piece of it, so I'll probably have some questions for you later, but I'm not going to tackle it just yet.
So to be clear, there's no enrollment projections in this.
Oh, I know.
That's wholly separate.
I know that's
Okay.
that's completely different.
Okay.
I do have a question. You talk about how you want to pass off a lot of this work that can, oh, sorry, not pass off. That kind of sounds like it's sloughing, but the IR office is able to do a whole bunch of things. When there are some processes, because so many are automated, that need to change because maybe how an institution offers some things. An example for our own institution is you build things around like the 4-year program or bachelor degrees, but when you start introducing things like micro credentials and micro diplomas, and those are sometimes handled differently, how much of that change in automation, like of that process, is doable by the IR team? Because that looked pretty complicated to me, but maybe it's just because it was really in small print. But
part of it was definitely because it's in small print. But I think the short answer to that is usually the change required on the reporting side is commensurate with the change that's required on the operational side. So if what you're doing is making a change so that you're using the same, say, banner components, but you're coding things slightly differently, then making a change like that within one of these workflows is fairly straightforward. If you're using a whole other banner component that nobody's ever used before, that everybody has to get trained on, and the registrar's office is figuring out what business unit that works in, that probably means that's going to be bigger changes on this side as well. I don't mean to say by any stretch of the imagination that IT doesn't have to be involved. Partly the IT folks can normally point you at, okay, this banner component, this is where the data actually lives. And because we're pulling data out from the back end of banners, sometimes those questions, things that you think in the form in banners forms will be in one place actually end up in someplace else. So IT is certainly helpful there, but there's a not substantial portion of this that's also around access. So depending on how access to your systems is set up. So in some cases, if data ends up in a new form in banner, that has to go through a data governance process to make sure that the registrar signs off on IR getting access to it and that sort of thing. Doesn't happen every place, but those are certainly things to be aware of before you start going down these roads. And that has been part of the piece here is making sure that these workflows, which frankly are new on CAP's campus, are really have the access that they need, but don't have access to everything that they don't need.
Fair enough. We're a banner shop ourselves, and I know that sometimes it can be difficult to integrate some things into banner. How, I mean, for an organization like yourself who actually focuses on post-secondary, that's actually pretty awesome because a lot of places also do post-secondary.
Right.
In terms of converting things from banner through to those workflows that can then be used, how easy is that process? And easy is relative, I understand.
Easy is relative. So, I know not everybody here is from a banner school, but within the banner context, one example of something that's easier is really around enrollments, because those are fairly well defined. They're time bound. They're connected to students, that sort of thing. Ones that are always harder, and this is probably true of a PeopleSoft institution as well. I'm a little bit less familiar with colleagues, so I won't make pronouncements, but I bet you it's the same thing. It's really around curriculum. Like, asking the question of what curriculum is any student in at any given time is unfortunately often a lot more difficult than asking the question of what courses are they in. And trying to figure out the logic to make sure that you're in fact pulling the right curriculum at any given time, particularly when things like the CDW say, oh, well, you're reporting one program for the student for a particular term, but they might be in a bachelor's and simultaneously in a certificate, and then doing one of those micro credentials. And so figuring out how to take the round peg and shove it into the square hole, or inverse, is certainly one of the more interesting things, and definitely more difficult than just say enrollments.
Yeah, for sure. Are there any questions from anyone in the back? Evan, I'll grab you the microphone.
Maybe I'll pass it around. Oh, sure. Thanks, Pat. Great presentation. I have a question. As I understand it, the future of Banner, and maybe the future of all student information systems, is increasingly moving toward the cloud.
Yes.
The process you outline here is pretty similar to the one that we use. It requires direct access to the underlying tables in an on-prem Oracle instance.
Yep.
As we seem to be all pushing toward things living in the cloud and losing direct access to our underlying database instances, I guess I'm just kind of asking for your thoughts, because they think about taking this work and maybe sort of future-proofing it. Like, what comes next? Are we all going to find ourselves in a situation where 5-10 years from now, not having direct access to on-prem databases means we can't do governmental reporting?
I hope not. I hope at the very least that access to the underlying data ends up being one of the requirements of any RFP. I mean, I think you've hit on a great question, and part of the answer here is, I think this is where utilizing third-party tools that aren't built with a single paradigm in mind is actually quite helpful. So, for example, the scripts that we're replacing here they're Banner scripts. They run within a Banner database, and yeah, you could create some custom tables, but in terms of like calling a REST API for a web service, it's not going to happen. Tools like FME, they're really built to be generic data transformation tools. So you need to pull information out of one of those REST APIs. No problem, we can do that. So not this particular project, but we had another project for a college in the States where, yeah, we were pulling Banner data, but they wanted to augment that with some geographic data. And so we're actually connected into the US Census Bureau has a great tool if anybody ever needs to look at US geographic data that can take things like zip codes and at least give you the area in which somebody is in. And so, we're taking their Banner data, and then we're going and we're doing these lookups against a web-based API system, pulling that back in and blending all of that data into a data warehouse. So that's, that's one example. But that's, one of those things where I think it really does merit thinking about those other tools that can really, really help you, because just about every system there is some kind of access to data. It's just not SQL anymore. So being able to pull different APIs, combine those, and then bring in database info as well is going to be absolutely necessary.
Great, thanks.
Any other question? Okay, yeah. Yeah, you had a question. Sorry, Mike. Thank you. Very good presentation. If I understand it correctly, is the CDW owned by the province?
Yeah.
So the process that you are automating, this is from one university, Cap.
Yeah.
So the CDW is not owned by CapU.
Correct.
So all this process that is going on is just to generate the data that is submitted to the central data warehouse.
Yeah.
So is that process being done by each of those institutions?
Yes, is the short version. So I'm probably going to get the number wrong, but let's call it a little bit north of 20 different institutions that do CDW data submissions. And as I understand it, there's very little overlap in the way that their processes work. So we've done some work with a couple of them around their CDW processes, and certainly CAP's existing process did not map or mirror at all to the other institutions with whom we have worked. So as near as I can tell, it's all completely custom across the board. Most of the institutions are on Banner, some of them are on Colleague. So even though the data is coming from the same place, because part of this is really around business logic and how they've ended up utilizing those systems, there hasn't been as much opportunity for crossover as I think they hoped.
Just finally, in that case, so CAP does not have a CDW per se.
So no, they don't, but also it's a little bit of a technical quirk in that, yes, they actually do, because the way that the data gets submitted to the ministry is each institution has their own version of the CDW, and they do a backup of that Oracle database and they ship the whole backup. I think they actually used to do it on tape. Now, at least they don't do it on tape and through snail mail anymore, but they actually do a backup of that database and then it gets restored at the ministry. So yes, you're right. They don't all have a CDW, but from a technical perspective, they actually kind of do.
Okay. And then when you guys do the forecast then will be the kind of the primary source for the forecast will be the data from CAP or the data from the CDW, which the government owns.
So we haven't actually done forecast or the kind of forecasting we've been talking about with CAP. Ultimately, when we did do forecasting, if we did it with CAP, we would be pulling from their local system, not from what the ministry has. We wouldn't be getting access to other institutions' data. Really, the forecast is institution specific.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, Michael.
Thanks. Great. I got a two-parter for you, Patrick. So number one, in doing the data prep for this application, do you or Capilano see benefits of other kind of ways to use that same data structure data model? Because I would assume that the way you're modeling it, if it lends itself to that use, it would probably lend itself to other types of internal reports. Generally, yes.
It's a little bit less so in this case, only because the data format has been determined by the ministry. It's not really our data format. It's the ministry goes, here's a PDF, here's what the tables need to look like, here's the data definitions, fill them in. So to our minds, it's a good start, but there's actually a fair amount of data that the CDW is missing. If I were to build it from scratch, it would be substantially more comprehensive. but there's certainly no reason that you couldn't use it for, one of the pieces about this is because it is what the ministry relies on for their FTE calculations for pretty much anything related to funding. Institutions generally want to make sure that they're matching their FTEs the same way, and that when they, figure out internally, what program X or what's course X got, that they're mirroring that. So certainly from that perspective, that's one of the things that's been really helpful about this data, and being able to generate it more frequently is that internal FTE piece.
Okay, and then part two, slightly different take on things. So I'm doing a presentation later today that's looking at sort of upstream fixes. So when you do a project, are there things you could fix at source down the road, or processes you identified? So I'm curious through this, because as you're trying to make the data work for you, you may be pointing out or indicating, hey, if we only use this field better, if you cleaned up some of these definitions, it would actually eventually eliminate, or maybe even immediately eliminate, some of the coding you have to do. Did you find as part of your process there was some of those learnings, or some ability to impact just source data improvement or process improvements?
Absolutely. I think there's kind of two different places that, if we separate the data a little bit, there's two different places where I think that's particularly applicable. One is the case where you suggested, where it's like, if we code something a little bit different in Banner, it's easier. So it actually predates this a little bit, but CAP has gone through a process of basically revamping. This was actually one of the things I was going to talk to you about, Mike. They revamped the entire way that they coded their programs in the system. So they looked at their old program codes and major codes that they had in Banner, and figured that they really didn't make a whole lot of sense. They'd been living there since 1980 whatever, and so they went through a fairly strenuous process of, okay, what should our program codes look like? What should our major codes look like? How do those two things relate to one another? How do they relate elsewhere? And they've changed the way that they've inputted that data in the source system, and it's really made a lot of this a whole lot easier than it would have been even 3 or 4 years ago. The kind of related but separate piece to me is the places where you have data that you need for reporting purposes, but you don't really need them for operational purposes. And where does that live? So as an example, the ministry provides a list. Sorry, let me back up. One of the uses of the CDW, and one of the great things from the ministry, from the institution's perspective, is that the ministry for these institutions then takes care of the PCIS reporting. So they don't have to submit to both the CDW and PCIS, but that means that some of the codes that they do submit have to align with StatCan's definitions. So StatCan has a list of post-secondary institutions, and StatCan has a list of high schools. And they have their own codes for those that, of course, don't match, I suspect, what anybody has in their SIS, and certainly don't match what CAP has in the SIS. So somewhere you need a crosswalk. That's pretty much unavoidable. But part of the question is, where should that crosswalk live? So in some of these cases, particularly around transfer credit, part of what we discovered is some of those crosswalks lived in Excel, and some of them lived in Access, and some of them lived in people's heads, and they were just done manually. And so part of this was having conversations with the registrar and going, okay, like, I know nobody has capacity to take on additional work, but Banner can do these crosswalks. And in fact, they'd already built the high school crosswalk. We were just asking for the post-secondary crosswalk, and thankfully, the registrar is like, yeah, no problem. We'll figure out how to make that work. So that's still in process. But part of what that does is really brings the data entry, rather than, a new post-secondary institution showing up in the Banner system, and then 6 months later there's some transfer credit, and then 6 months later somebody in IR goes, oh, what's this? Then you can actually push that left and really have it be at the very beginning of your business process. Say, okay, when a new transfer institution gets created here, you also have to go over here and enter it here. And this is the table you have to look it up at. And so it's hopefully going to make the data entry a lot cleaner, and it's going to make things a lot easier for the IR folks. But yes, there are absolutely those opportunities.
Thank you. Thank you, Patrick. So we've reached the end of our session. Thank you for your presentation. And on behalf of Patrick and Plaid Consulting, This year's Serpa Conference has made a donation to the Ganiganichik. We have a lot of, well, we're kind of a little bit long on time, but if you do have a chance to take out your device and do the session evaluation, that would be really helpful. It's used in determining who this year's best presentation award winner is, who then gets an opportunity to go to the AIR conference. But please do enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you. Thank you very much. Please, let's give a round of applause to Patrick.